The Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s had huge consequences for the development of international politics for the next 2 decades. The Mujahideen insurgency, which originally rose up against the Afghan Communist government in 1978, now had the unenviable task of going toe-to-toe with a military superpower in the shape of the Soviet Union. The subsequent resilience and tenacity shown by the Afghan guerrilla forces stunned not only the Soviet forces, but much of the world. They were duly rewarded for their perseverance with an abundance of material and moral support from a number of pivotal allies. The 9 or so years of warfare has been argued by many to have had a significant bearing on the outcome of the Cold War. Not to mention the fact that it would go on to play a huge role in determining Afghanistan's fate until today. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1979, Soviet forces started moving into the country under the pretext of a pre-existing friendship treaty. They quickly pinpointed key centers of telecommunication with the aim of disabling the communications network, so that the Soviets could take hold of the capital Kabul and carry out Operation Storm 333 3 days later. This was the name given to the operation under which President Amin was assassinated by Soviet Special Forces, aka the Spetsnaz, in the Tajbek Palace. The daring operation was a remarkable success, carried out in just 40 minutes. The very next day, the Soviets brought in Babrak Karmal, perceived to be a more moderate communist, as Afghanistan's new president. By the beginning of 1980, approximately 80,000 Soviet troops had poured into the country through 2 ground routes and 1 air corridor. Their instructions were to take control of the major urban centers and highways inside the country. The reaction of the international community was largely unanimous.
No words, therefore, which I shall say today can fully convey the deep sense of disappointment and disillusion which the government and people of Nigeria felt when they heard the news of Soviet armed intervention in Afghanistan, a third world developing non-aligned country which posed no immediate threat to the peace and security of the Soviet Union.
Most of the Islamic world strongly condemned the Soviet actions.
Actually, the Soviet invasion does not represent anything but imperialist expansion, aimed at establishing and consolidating a communist rule against the will of the peaceful Muslim Afghan people.
Whilst the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution protesting against the Soviet invasion by a vote of 104 to 18. The Soviets stated that it was a legitimate intervention since they were obliging aid requested by the official Afghan government. However, the international community was not convinced by this. Why would President Amin invite the Soviets in to kill him and topple his government? The reaction of the Afghan people was similarly unanimous. The Soviet military's presence did not have the desired effect the Bolshevik high command was seeking. Instead of bringing security and stability, it invoked a deep-seated hostility to the idea of a foreign invasion within the Afghans. The British had had first-hand experience with the patriotic fervour of the Afghans during the 19th century. Now that Islam was also under attack, in the eyes of the Muslim population, there was no way that the Soviets could have the early withdrawal that they wanted. The unpopularity of this war amongst the Afghans served as the perfect recruitment tool for the Mujahideen groups, the most prominent of which established their headquarters across the border in Pakistan. Throughout the course of the war, roughly 6 million Afghans were forced to flee the country. That's around a third of the entire country. In fact, there are some that estimate that half of the world's refugees in the 1980s were Afghan, with more than 3 million moving to Pakistan, whilst around 2 million fled to Iran. These refugee camps, especially the ones in Pakistan, served as focal centers of recruitment for the cause of jihad. It should be specified that this migration was not merely an ideological reaction to the infidel Soviets. Rather, a significant amount of it was due to Soviet military tactics and practices. Initially, the situation was characterized by the Soviets being content with their enclave strategy. That is, they were committed to defending major cities and roads, whilst avoiding large-scale pacification campaigns in the countryside, which was largely controlled by the Mujahideen. But soon after, the Soviets started to favor more of an aggressive policy that went hand in hand with President Karmal's calls in 1982 for a campaign called From City to Village, which would try to extend communist control from the provincial centers out to the rural areas. Naturally, this led to an intensification of conflict. The Soviets would attack villages that they suspected of harboring the Mujahideen. A lot of the times, the villagers were unfortunate that the Mujahideen attacked a Soviet convoy near their village, which subsequently led to Soviet reprisal attacks on civilians. According to the eminent Afghan historian Muhammad Hassan Kakar, the Afghans were the victims of a deliberate attempt at genocide. He states, "The claim of the Soviet Union that it dispatched its limited contingent to repulse foreign aggression proved groundless after the uprising of February 1980, when its war machine began to kill not only the Mujahideen, but also defenseless civilians throughout the country." Frustrated by the tough resistance and their inability to suppress it expeditiously, the Soviets embarked on a program of genocide. Whilst this statement may seem exaggerated, there was certainly a conscious effort on the Soviet leadership's part to intimidate the countryside into submission. This included indiscriminate massacres, rape, forced depopulation, the destruction of crops and irrigation, leaving millions of mines scattered across the country, some of them being booby traps disguised as children's toys. In conjunction with this, the communist Afghan secret police, Khad, was also especially feared and despised throughout the country. Rather than breaking the morale of the Afghan people and Mujahideen, these heavy-handed tactics only served to reinforce their stubborn resistance. Even though the rugged and determined nature of the Mujahideen would prove to be the bedrock of the Afghan path to victory, it is impossible to undermine the importance of the role played by foreign countries in supporting their efforts. Within the Afghan resistance, the Americans saw an opportunity to undermine their Cold War rivals. And so began Operation Cyclone, one of the biggest and longest covert CIA operations ever, where America sent financial aid to the Mujahideen. To shed more light on this, we now go to Cypher from Cynical Historian.
The United States and the rest of NATO immediately protested the Soviet invasion. 65 countries boycotted the 1980 Olympics, including communist China and Albania. The Warsaw Pact returned the favor by boycotting the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. President Jimmy Carter, in a startling flash of decisive action for once, began funneling funds to the Mujahideen, starting with $30 million. By 1987, that number rose to 630 million. American policymakers, like CIA Chief William Casey and Congressman Charlie Wilson, lobbied for this increase, which newly elected President Ronald Reagan was all too happy to authorize. Reagan was a Cold Warrior and used the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan to turn funding from welfare programs to the military in order to fight what he called the evil empire. During the 1985 State of the Union address, he said,
"We must stand by all our democratic allies, and we must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent from Afghanistan to Nicaragua to defy Soviet-supported aggression and secure rights which have been ours from birth. Support for freedom fighters is self-defense."
This was the Reagan Doctrine, and it dictated U.S. support of the Mujahideen.
It should be mentioned that the Americans were extremely careful and measured in extending their military support to the Mujahideen. The idea of Afghanistan becoming the USSR's Vietnam was not so enthusiastically embraced by the American political machine at the beginning of the conflict. And for good reason. For starters, unlike America and Vietnam, the Soviet Union actually shared a border with the Afghans, thus reducing potential logistical issues. Also, the Soviets, along with their Russian Empire predecessors, had a rich history of invasions, giving them an advantage in expertise. And lastly, the issue of human casualties in a war was not a regime-shaking matter for the authoritarian Bolsheviks. So for the first few years of the war, the Americans were cautious about leaving their footprint in Afghanistan, fearing that if the resistance fails, it would become another blow to them, which would mean that the Vietnam Syndrome, the American public's aversion to involvement in overseas conflicts, would not only not heal, but it would actually get even worse. Therefore, the more the Afghan resistance endured and strengthened, the more the USA would increase their military assistance. American aid was funneled to the Mujahideen through the conduit of the ISI, the Pakistani Secret Service. The Pakistani government, under the military general, President Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, threw its full weight of support behind the Afghan resistance, accommodating the millions of refugees and providing training camps for the Mujahideen. General Zia skillfully used the Afghan issue for his own political ambition by gripping on to absolute power for 10 years. At the same time, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan served Zia's national interests as well, since it deflected attention away from the nuclear program which Pakistan was actively pursuing. Saudi Arabia was another major contributor to the Mujahideen cause. Officially, they stated that they would match the USA's financial aid. Iran played a key role in helping the Shia Mujahideen factions, especially from the Hazara ethnic group. The Communist government of China was also involved in aiding the Mujahideen against their fellow communist rivals, the Soviets. Interestingly, what is often downplayed is the role played by private donations. Journalist Jason Burke references an interview with the head of the ISI during the war, Hamid Gul, and states that as little as 25% of the money for the Afghan jihad was actually supplied directly by states. The resolve of the Mujahideen and the foreign aid combined to create a clinical and effective force that the Soviets and their Afghan communist allies could not contain. The Mujahideen ensured that this would be an Afghan-style war, one which saw the tough mountainous terrain of the country being used to produce a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. It is tough to know for sure their true strength of numbers, but it is estimated that the Mujahideen had up to 250,000 fighters. They specialized in hit-and-run tactics, as well as ambushing convoys. Whilst they started out with the outdated Enfield rifles, the Afghan Mujahideen moved on to the now iconic AK-47 Kalashnikovs as their favored weapon. A particularly menacing foe for them was the Soviet gunships, such as the Mi-24 Hind gunships that were used in search and destroy operations. This issue was tackled by the Americans, who in 1986 started supplying the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles, which were heat-seeking missiles that were shot at Soviet gunships. Some analysts viewed the introduction of these surface-to-air missiles as a game-changer, going on to coin the term the Stinger effect, although their effectiveness is debated by others. Whilst on the ground, the Mujahideen had operational agency to determine their best course of action within their small groups, the wider movement did have political leaders that formed their own parties which the Mujahideen would then affiliate themselves with. The Pakistani-based Peshawar 7 was by far the most important group of parties in the war effort. They were supported by America, Saudi Arabia, and of course, Pakistan. The most prominent party of the Peshawar 7 was the Hizb-e-Islami, an Islamist group led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. This group received the lion's share of the aid from America, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. But the group's leader, Hekmatyar, has received intense criticism throughout the years for being an extremist that was more focused on enlarging his own influence than the cause of defeating the Soviets. According to CIA officer Graham Fuller, he spent a lot more of his time fighting other Mujahideen than killing Soviets. He has been accused on numerous occasions of ordering assassinations and attacks on other Mujahideen factions during the war. In this regard, Hekmatyar is often juxtaposed with Ahmad Shah Massoud, a commander for the Jamiyat-e-Islami party. The charismatic Massoud was lionized by the Western media for his tactical brilliance in guerrilla warfare as the Lion of Panjshir. The Wall Street Journal published an editorial about Massoud in 1992 titled "The Afghan Who Won the Cold War." But Massoud's track record seems to be as murky as Hekmatyar's. Throughout the war, Massoud was criticized by other Mujahideen parties for making deals with the Soviets. In 1983, he signed a year-long truce with the Soviets where he agreed to not attack Soviet convoys on their way through the pivotal Salang Tunnel from Soviet Central Asia to Kabul. It is tough to understate the importance of the Salang Tunnel for the Soviets. According to General Gromov, the commander of the Soviet 40th Army in Afghanistan, Ahmad Shah could have turned Salang into a Russian graveyard just by throwing rocks. His supporters claimed that he intended to use this time to rebuild his forces and give the war-weary inhabitants of the Panjshir Valley, where he himself was from, a break from the constant major Soviet campaigns in the area. But to his Afghan critics, that doesn't change the fact that Soviet forces could now focus on implementing their harsh and ruthless tactics on Massoud's fellow countrymen and women in other parts of the country. In spite of all this focus on specific leaders, it should not lead us to romanticize their roles. Whereas in reality, the Afghan Jihad was too big, too complicated, and had too many major actors for it to be boiled down and essentialized in the manner that Western journalists often portrayed it to be. Massoud's ceasefire with the Soviets is a perfect example of this sloppy portrayal, as well as the multifaceted nuances of the Afghan resistance. How can a man who had a ceasefire with the enemy be regarded as a leader of the resistance? In 1985, the reformist Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the USSR, and the Soviet need to exit Afghanistan gained fresh impetus. In preparation for their withdrawal, the Soviets gave greater responsibility to the Afghan Communist government. In 1986, they replaced President Karmal with Muhammad Najibullah, the former head of the Afghan Secret Service. President Najibullah was clearly given instructions to take a policy of rapprochement with the opposition that would bring an end to hostilities. A program of national reconciliation was put forward, and in 1987 a new constitution was ratified, which amongst other things showed a greater role for Islam in the political outlook of the Afghan Communist government. Already severely weakened by thousands of soldiers defecting every year, the Afghan Communist government welcomed the idea of a power-sharing scenario with the Mujahideen. But the notion of making peace with a weak puppet communist regime that was ideologically antagonistic to Islam was not enticing for the Mujahideen leadership. Regardless, Gorbachev had to find a way to withdraw from Afghanistan, which he described as a bleeding wound. Finally, in April 1988, the Geneva Accords were signed by Afghanistan, USSR, Pakistan, and America, securing the withdrawal of Soviet forces from the country. The Mujahideen leadership, however, was furious that they were left out of the Geneva talks. By February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldiers had left Afghanistan. They had lost around 15,000 soldiers in the conflict. But the war took an especially heavy toll on Afghanistan. More than 9 years of fighting had left anywhere between 500,000 to 2 million Afghans dead. A third of the population was forced to flee the country, whilst there were more than 1 million Afghans displaced within the country. More than 2 million Afghans were left wounded, a number that was guaranteed to increase even after the Soviets pulled out, because they had left more than 10 million unexploded mines scattered throughout the country. If we consider that Afghanistan had a reported population of about 15 million before the war, we can see that the Afghan-Soviet war subjected most of the nation to becoming a casualty of some form. As for the future of the country, the words of a Soviet captain who served in Afghanistan would prove fateful. Children born in Afghanistan at the start of the war have been brought up in war conditions. This is their way of life. The aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal did not bring an end to war and conflict. In fact, it led to a number of key developments around the world. The USSR, already in the throes of a permanent decline, would collapse within 2 years, and all of its constituent member states would gain independence. As for the Americans, their interest in Afghanistan declined considerably now that their main strategic goal of dealing a blow to their Soviet counterparts was achieved. But it should be noted that up until the fall of the Afghan Communist government in 1992, the USA still sent hundreds of millions of dollars in aid money to the Mujahideen. Globally, it is hard to understate the importance of the Afghan-Soviet war to the prominence of militant Islamic fundamentalism that would come to define the 2000s. The most famous example of the link between the two was Osama bin Laden, and how the roots of his terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, can be traced back to the battlefields of Afghanistan, where he fought with the Mujahideen against the Soviet and Afghan communists. As for the Afghans, their woes and anguish were not over. It took 3 years of hard fighting for the Mujahideen to finally bring down the Afghan Communist government in 1992. Then, the world watched in horror as the Mujahideen groups immediately turned on each other and initiated a bitter 4-year-long civil war that saw the destruction of the capital, Kabul. And it was only brought to an end in 1996 by the emergence of the Taliban. 41 years after war began in Afghanistan, the country is still in a state of warfare today. Thank you guys for watching. I can't forget to thank my patrons for their continued support. Until next time, peace.